for joining me and welcome to this short little session today about access to work, what you need to know. My name is Gareth. I am one of the trainers here at Society Matters and I have the pleasure of talking to you about access to work today. And it is a pleasure. It's the best bit of my job, this. It's great. I get paid for this. Can you believe it? I'm going to be taking you through this short session today. The aim of today really is to talk about all things access to work for the next hour or so. So we're going to spend a bit of time, first of all, thinking about what is access to work. We'll think about the eligibility criteria. We'll think about what support it covers. We'll think about getting ready for making an access to work application. We'll think about where we can go to get support with an application if we need it. But also then we will spend a bit of time talking about where do we stand with access to work at the moment, because it has got a bit of attention in the press lately. So I do think it's worth thinking about kind of where we are at the minute. The way this session is going to work also, just to give you a bit of housekeeping before we get into things, if I may, this session is currently being recorded and it will be published in our newsletter most likely next month. If you have any questions at any point, hopefully you can tell I'm about as intimidating as a cream egg, and I did spot some familiar faces when they were joining, so hopefully they'll back me up here. If you have any questions at any point, please do just take yourselves off mute or pop a message in the chat and I will answer it as I see it. This session, we've said it's going to last about an hour. In all likelihood, it probably won't be quite that long because what we've done is we've budgeted a bit of time at the end, if you like, for a kind of a final Q&A. So what I'm going to do is when we get to the final Q&A, I will stop the recording and then we can ask any other questions that you might have. And also, I'm very happy to hang about at the end if you have any questions that you want to ask personally or privately as well. What I will be doing with this session also, once we get to the end of the session, I've got everybody's email address from when you signed up. I will send you an email with a list of resources and some links that will be relevant to what we talk about today. So you will have something to keep and refer back to. Now, before we get into things properly, if I could just give you a little bit of background about myself and about us at Society Matters, just in case this is your first time joining us. So as I said, my name's Gareth. I'm one of the trainers here at Society Matters. I've worked here for about 3 years near enough, or in this particular role. I don't mind saying I do actually use access to work myself, so I've kind of seen it from the other side. So again, if you have any questions, I promise I'm your guy. But Society Matters itself, more broadly, it is the training subsidiary of Citizens Advice Gateshead, but we are a KIC, community interest company. So what we do is we deliver a range of courses on various different kind of social welfare issues. So think access to work, for example, think universal credit, immigration, debt, housing and homelessness. It's citizens advice. So if you can think of it, then we probably do cover it. And we try and feed the knowledge and the experience that we have as advisors into courses and webinars like this today. And on the screen there is just a few of the organisations that we're very proud to support and also to work alongside. That's it. That's me spiel over, I promise. So I want to give us a little bit of context and just kind of where we sit with access to work at the moment. But I'm just curious, first of all, I'm going to throw it out to you guys. If you want to just take yourselves off mute or pop a message in the chat, how familiar are you with access to work? What do you know about it? What do you think about it? What's your thoughts? Where's James? Alex? Oh, I can see messages coming through on the chat there. Sorry, thank you. Very little knowledge. No, that's absolutely fine. Thank you. Not very familiar. That's okay. I promise you're in the right place. I promise. You have me word. Helps to break barriers and maintain regular employment, Claire saying. Oh, I like that, Claire. That's a nice way to think about it, isn't it? Yeah. Access to work, first and foremost, it's a government-funded grant that enables people with health conditions and disabilities to excuse me, to find and to stay in work and remove those barriers that they might have. Alex, I have quite some knowledge about the procedure and the time frame as well as the grant letter. Oh, you've done your homework, Alex. I like it. I like it. Sarge, you're saying you've applied for equipment for staff and interpreter costs. Oh, okay. Oh, lovely, lovely, lovely. So we've got a kind of a range of knowledge there. Lovely. So yeah, access to work itself, like we've said, it's a grant that's available to employees or disabled people to help them find work, to help them stay in work. It is a grant. It is not a cash benefit in the sense of PIP, for instance, or universal credit, where you get X amount of money every month. But we'll talk more about that a bit later. So just to give us a little bit of context, then about access to work. Currently, it supports around about 60,000 people out of a disabled population, if you like, of around 5.5 million. In terms of the total expenditure of access to work, though, it's around about at the moment £257 million. So think £257 million supporting around about 60,000 people. Now, I will say I was looking at some statistics the other day because it's what I do in my spare time now, apparently. There was some projected expenditure. It was estimated that by 2029, 2030, it was actually going to cost around about £700 million potentially by the end of the decade. So it is rising, certainly, but we'll talk more about that a bit later on. Now, some research that was done previously, people that were surveyed said that 70% said they couldn't have attained or maintained employment without the scheme. 86% of those people surveyed credited it with helping them stay in work or just run a business. And as of February 2025, there are around 62,000 applications waiting for a decision. Bear in mind, currently supporting about 61,000 people. Do any of those statistics maybe jump out at people? Are you surprised by those? Are you not surprised by those? What do you think? Wes, you're saying you're surprised? Okay. I'm going to pick on you slightly, if I may, Wes. What are you surprised at? Figures are high, surprised at the high cost. Mhm, mhm. The amount, it's a huge figure. Yeah, £257 million at the end of the day. Like we said, it's projected that it will rise quite significantly by the end of the decade. It's worth saying a couple of months ago, the government actually launched a consultation on some proposed reforms to access to work. That consultation closed at the end of June. The government adds yet they haven't actually said, well, they're still considering the responses rather, so they haven't outlined what those reforms would look like. So we won't be talking about them today, quite simply because we don't know. With the government haven't announced anything yet, but it is something that we're keeping our eye on. £257 million for 62,000 people seems like a lot. Yeah, potentially. I mean, I'm not good enough at maths to sort of work it out in my head. I'm not Carol Vorderman, but it does. It seems like a bit, I would say, potentially. What do you think it says about society more generally if 70% of people said they couldn't have maintained employment without the scheme? 86% of employees credit it with helping them stay in work. 86%, 70%. What do you think that says about society, about the way that we accommodate disabled people? Do you have any thoughts on that? That's something that needs to change in the UK, Alex, health related, I mean. So do you mean in terms of supporting people back into work, or do you mean the way that we sort of view health, if that makes sense? Employees aren't able to do it without this support. Yeah, we're going to talk about that very soon. It's a valuable resource for disabled adults that help them stay in work. Yeah, it is. I can't remember who it is, but I know a couple of years ago, I remember a government minister saying that access to work at one point was the government's best kept secret, because it wasn't very widely known about. It wasn't very widely utilised, to be frank. I mean, that is changing now. We're going to talk about things like the timeframes for your applications and so a bit later on. Society is not inclusive in the workplace for people with disabilities. I mean, that's the gold standard, isn't it? To have a fully inclusive society, because we know that disabled people are perfectly capable of maybe finding and staying employment, if they have the right support, for instance. And that is very much what access to work is aiming to address those barriers that people face. So then, firstly, thinking about the eligibility criteria for access to work, how am I actually eligible? There's a few criteria that I need to meet. I need to have a disability or a health condition that means that I need some kind of support to do my job. I need to be in or about to start or return to some form of paid employment. I need to be 16 or over. I need to live and work in England, Scotland, or Wales. And for mental health support, I can only claim access to work once. If I've received it before, I can only get it that one time. I do want to take a second just to clear up a bit of a misconception that I sometimes run across. I don't know how familiar you are with the benefit system, but I imagine that some of you at least will have heard of a benefit called personal independence payment. Now, to be clear, you do not need to be receiving PIP in order to get access to work. But I'm going to caveat that slightly because it can help. It can make the process a little bit smoother. If you get PIP and you are applying for access to work, what the DWP can do is they can use the evidence, the medical evidence, or what you write in your PIP claim form within your access to work application. So it means that you wouldn't have to kind of send duplicate evidence. Essentially, it makes that process a bit smoother, a bit more streamlined. So I'm going to use myself as an example. I get PIP, I used access to work. When I applied for access to work, I actually didn't have to supply any medical evidence of any kind because it was already covered within what was in my PIP application. Julie, question there, is that one time per employer or one time regardless of if you change? It is one time. It is one time only. That's it. What do you think about that in particular? Do you have any thoughts on the eligibility criteria? If I need mental health support, then yeah, I'll get it once. Am I right to think that even if you are not disabled, you can apply for access to work? So you do need to have some kind of disability or health condition that affects the ability to do your job. So maybe you have a physical health condition that affects your ability to get into the office. It might be dyslexia. There's a whole, it's a range of things that it could be, but you do need to have some kind of health condition. Oh, sorry, if you are, was that expected to be disabled there, Alex? Like if you are expected to be, no worries, sorry, my fault. So you would need to have a health condition. So you wouldn't necessarily be able to sort of preemptively apply for access to work. You'd need to have a health condition. Mm. But in terms of the eligibility criteria, personally, this is the one that gets me, the mental health support. Mm. So Alex is saying there, so you need to have a diagnosis. So it would certainly help to have a diagnosis because that in effect is a kind of evidence that yes, I do have, dyslexia or whatever it might be. Sorry, I'm using dyslexia as an example there. But you need to have some kind of health condition that affects your ability to do your job. Strictly speaking, excuse me, a little bit like PIP, you don't need a diagnosis, but you would need some kind of evidence to show that you had a health condition that affected your ability to do the job, if that makes sense. So hopefully that answers your question there. Helen, you're saying mental health can have more than one episode. Seems unfair. Can be diagnosed with more than one mental illness. Mhm. I completely agree. I completely agree with you there, Helen. I have depression, for instance. Maybe I get some treatment, maybe it might be through access to work or maybe through my GP, whatever it might be. Maybe my health improves. Okay, and then I think, oh, I don't need this support anymore. Hooray. But what if my circumstances change in the future? Sorry, you've had it once. What kind of message does that send to people? Does anyone have any questions there? Sorry, before we move on. No? All good? Right. So, just to mention as well, sorry, you are absolutely within your right to apply for access to work if you work from home as well. You can still apply for access to work just like any other person if you are still working from home. Thinking about it in the context of people with disabilities, health conditions, in some ways it might even be easier for them to work from home. I know at the time, I think it was when maybe towards the end of time when the Conservatives were in power, there was a lot of talk around sort of helping disabled people into or encouraging them to look for work where they were working from home. Because, for example, if you had mobility challenges by working from home, in theory at least, you didn't have to worry about that mobility challenge. But in those cases, if you're working from home, you are still able to apply for access to work just like anybody else. So, what can access to work cover then? Now, the great thing about access to work, credit where credit's due, absolutely, it can cover all sorts of things. And it really just depends on what kind of support that disabled person needs, how their health condition affects their ability to do their job, a whole range of things that it could be. So it could be support workers, for instance. So it might be that somebody has a physical health condition that maybe affects their ability to do certain aspects of the job, in which case we can actually use access to work to fund support workers to help people with uh, aspects of their job potentially. It might be the cost of taxi travel. So maybe I'm going to use myself as an example here. I might as well. I come in handy for something. My access to work covers taxis to and from the office. So the way it works is that I pay for the taxi, I use Uber, and then I claim the money back through access to work. It might be specialist equipment or assistive software. So it could be things like Drag and Dictate, the voice recognition software, whole range of things that it could be. Might be physical changes to your workplace. So it could be um, the installation of, say, wheelchair ramps, widening doorways, could potentially be adaptations to a vehicle if the person is not able to use public transport. I will caveat this one ever so slightly with adaptations to a vehicle and with certain access to work support, you may be expected to sort of contribute yourself. So in certain circumstances, access to work will cover the full cost of something. But I know with adaptations to a vehicle, if it's your personal vehicle, the person would be expected to provide a contribution towards that, because by adapting the vehicle, they're getting a wider benefit, if you like, beyond work itself. Or it could even be things like communication support at interviews. So it might be you're looking for work, so you haven't actually got a job yet. You can still apply for access to work, and you can apply for communication support. So it could be things like maybe a British Sign Language interpreter. It could be maybe an advocate to sort of go into the interview with you and help you sort of put your points across. Maybe the person has something like depression or anxiety, for instance. But I will add, with the communication support at interviews, just to be clear, that is regardless of whether you actually get the job. Just to make that apparent. It's not just a case of you can only get it if you get the job later on. It's just you get the communication support at the interview, regardless of the actual outcome. All right. Do you think there's anything within there, the different types of support, that might be sort of underutilized or overlooked a little bit? Do you think some might be more common than others? Mm. I know sometimes there is software and equipment like ergonomic chair, travel equipment software. Diane, oh, hello, Diane. Support workers never realized you could have this. Equipment is more common. Equipment. Ah, yeah, you've hit on something here. So I'm gonna ask you a question, folks. Employers have a legal responsibility under the Equality Act to make reasonable adjustments. What do you think then is the difference between a reasonable adjustment that an employer makes versus something access to work might cover? Where do you think the line might be drawn? What do you think the distinction might be? Claire, you're saying, I'm guessing it boils down to costs. Yeah, that can come into it, certainly. You know, if you are a small business, for example, and you need to make substantial changes that might be quite expensive for an employee, it might be that we apply to access to work to fund those changes instead. Costs, Helen's saying as well, the small amount the employer covers. Absolutely. It comes down to costs and also the legal obligations that your employer has. Alex, oh, you've done your homework there, Alex. I like it. Reasonable adjustment is something that the company is obliged to support an employee only if it's reasonable, like if the impact is not massive on the team. Sarge, you're saying reasonable adjustments are minor changes that can be carried out and might benefit the wider group. Access to work is person specific. Alex, again, if it's not reasonable adjustment, then the company doesn't have to implement this adjustment. So that's potentially when you might be looking at something like access to work instead. So yeah, you've hit on something there. So for example, and again, I'm going to use me as an example, access to work covers my taxi travel to and from the office because it wouldn't be reasonable to expect my employer to contribute that if it was just me and it was expensive and so on. But within that, I also have, so I'm talking to you now, I have a desk and a chair that is set up specifically for me. So the chair, for example, was provided through my employer through a DSE desk assessment, for instance, and it was set up specifically for me. That right there would be something like your reasonable adjustment that your employer might, excuse me, might be expected to provide. Access to work would step in with maybe those bigger, maybe the more expensive changes, for instance, things like your support workers or your taxi travel or getting your vehicle adapted, potentially even things like changes to your workplace as well. So to go back to what a few people have mentioned, I think it was Alex there, something the company is obliged to support only if it's reasonable, like if the impact is not massive on the team. Diane, you're saying that mine's at home. I work over a number of offices, but then I use I use my desk, my chair, etc., to do my admin duties. Oh, good. Well, I'm glad you've got the support that you need. But yeah, it just shows the difference that it can make, doesn't it? So yeah, when it comes down to reasonable adjustments versus access to work, your reasonable adjustments, they are your legal obligation as an employer that they need to make for disabled employees. So like we said, it might be those smaller things like the desk or the chair or changes maybe to certain working practices. Access to work is the grand scheme that's meant to fund support beyond the employer's legal requirements. Excuse me. Sorry, I've got a bit of a cough. Perks the job. So, where are we at the moment with access to work? Well, like we said, first and foremost, I do think it's worth, being clear. It is a hugely important tool when it comes to helping people with disabilities find work and stay in work. The government, quite rightly, there's a big focus at the moment on helping people with health conditions into work. Now, the flip side of that is that in the last few years, access to work, it has generally come under increasing demand, which means that now, unfortunately, there are longer waiting times than there were historically. So I'm going to use myself as an example once again. When I applied it would have been about 2 years ago now, just gone 2 years, in fact. There was a 3-month waiting list. So I filled in my application form, I sent it off, and it took about 3 months for the DWP to get back to me. And then we had a chat about what help I needed. And then after that, it was only about a week or two beyond that where my access to work was in place. Unfortunately now, because of the demand on access to work, it has led to longer waiting times, typically of around about a year potentially at the moment. It is something 6-month delay, you're saying there, Alex. So I was doing some digging the other day, and the figure that I found was around about 9 months to a year at the moment, is what I found. But it's, I mean, even a 6-month delay is quite long in and of itself, isn't it? What kind of impact do you think that has on somebody? You need that support at work, and you're not going to get it for 9 months, a year. Mm. I was told by an employee a manager had to wait about 9 months. Yeah, it sounds about right, James. About, mhm. So if I may, James, I'm going to use your employee there as an example, if I'm maybe a little bit cheeky. How is that employee going to manage in that 9 month wait? Mm. Alex is saying it has a massive impact. I mean, if the company believe the employee may need 1 or 2 items, sometimes they order them without access to work. Yeah, yeah. Well, it's what my employer did. I needed a chair, they got a chair. I needed a footrest, they got a footrest. It's a little thing, but depending on the cost, yeah, of course. They might not be able to start work, they might not be able to stay in work. It's difficult to manage if, for example, taxis feel a burden to the team as having to get a lift from colleagues. So yeah, it might be that until that support is in place, we're having to maybe rely on our colleagues more than we might otherwise have to. There was a story I was reading I think it was on BBC News just the other day, a gentleman who used his access to work grant to fund support workers, and he'd started his own business. He'd got a support worker 5 days a week, and unfortunately, his support was not cut completely, but reduced a bit. And I think he went from 5 days a week to about 2 days a week. And so it left him with this question of, well, what do I do now? Essentially, how do I get by? Mm. Such delays are not encouraging disabled people into work. I'd had a client that had to wait to start her new job for a year until support was in place. That must be difficult. You've got a job lined up, but you've got to wait to start, and all of the positive things that come along with starting a job, that sense of well-being and contributing to society, and oh, I'll have a bit of money, and so on. And yeah, it must be frustrating. Now, I will say this is something the government are actively working to address. We do expect that situation to improve, thankfully. But just as an idea, this is where we are at this moment in time. So, thinking about preparing for your access to work application, what kind of things do you think we need to think about if we are thinking about applying for access to work? If somebody said to you, your employee comes to you one day and says, I'm thinking about applying for access to work, what do I need to do? What do I need to get together? What do I need to think about? What would you say? You're absolutely right, Alex. The company can't apply on the person's behalf. So it would be the employee that applies for access to work. But what they would do is when you apply, it asks for the contact details of, say, your line manager, and then access to work, the DWP would then maybe contact the line manager to discuss the arrangements. But yeah, you're absolutely right. It's not something the company do themselves, but it's something the employee does. Mm. Diane, so you're saying you might want to think about things like medical letters, how the disability affects them. So how does it impact them doing their job? Mhm. Evidence of the impact, evidence of health issues. Yeah, absolutely. So I would want to be thinking about then, like we said, evidence, medical evidence that supports the issues that I have. I'd want to think about what kind of help do I actually think I'm going to need. Mm. Yeah, absolutely right, James. What adjustments can we put in place now? So what has my employer already done? How has that helped? Is there something that maybe access to work can help with in terms of going that little bit further? How long am I going to need that help for? How am I doing at the moment? So, for example, and again, I'm going to use me, when I applied for my taxis to and from work, it asked questions. It's an online application form I filled in. It asked questions about how do you manage getting to and from work at the moment. So, do you use public transport? Do you get a lift from a relative or a colleague? And then I would expand on, how I got to work, but then the impact of that on me. So I might say, oh, it was difficult because I get tired easily or whatever it might be, and it was difficult to concentrate and so on. So we do need to drill down that little bit deeper, I would say, and just make really clear the impact that the health condition is having and the impact that the support provided through access to work would have. We might need to think about what costs are involved. So again, I'm going to use me. If I was thinking about taxi travel, because you are expected in that case to make a contribution towards that, you need to think about what your normal travel costs to work are, because that will be taken away from the money that access to work then reimburse. But if it's thinking about things like equipment, okay, where are you going to get the equipment from? How much is it going to cost? Is there anything else you can think of there, folks? Anything else you might want to ask? Mm. Have we covered all our bases, do you think? Mm. That's all right. Right. So we're going to put it into practice a little bit then. So we've got a couple of case studies that we're going to look at. So first up, we have Rebecca. Rebecca has been diagnosed with ADHD. It affects her focus, her organisation, and her time management. She works in an office as part of a marketing agency. Rebecca was struggling and needs support to manage her workload. So what kind of support do you think might be available to Rebecca with access to work? Grammarly? Okay. So you're thinking there in terms of ADHD, maybe affecting our focus, things like our typing and so on? Is that what you're thinking there, Alex? Helen, you're saying software? I'm going to pick on you if I may, Helen. What kind of software are you thinking of? Just while they're thinking. Anything else? Alex is saying, yeah, also written instructions in advance of receiving, although maybe that's more of a reasonable adjustment. Scheduling software, something to help her organize her work. Okay, okay. Yeah. Anything else? I agree, by the way, but yeah. Own office, so less distraction. Yeah, although I would say that would maybe be more down to a reasonable adjustment on the employer's side more than access to work, but potentially, yeah. So I would want to look at things like, again, like we've mentioned, maybe some kind of software that might be available to help her with scheduling and so on. But also with access to work, if you are neurodiverse, then potentially you can get help with things like job coaching. So it might be that Rebecca can get some specific kind of ADHD job coaching to help with things like time management and focus strategies and so on. That would be available through access to work. We could potentially look at things even like noise cancelling headphones to help her with her focus and so she's less distracted. We could certainly look at things like maybe scheduling software or some kind of assistive software there. Mm, absolutely, absolutely. Then we have Malcolm. So Malcolm suffers from chronic knee and back problems affecting his mobility. Malcolm is working as a senior developer in a collaborative office-based team. The challenge he faces is that he couldn't commute independently so there's a risk of leaving employment if he can't attend the office. He finds it difficult to sit at his desk for long periods of time, as well as using the chair he's been provided with. So I'm going to caveat this firstly. I'm going to make it two parts. Firstly, what support do you think would be available to Malcolm through access to work? But also, is there anything that his employer could do as well in terms of a reasonable adjustment? Sit and stand desk, yeah, if that's something that if he felt would be useful, we could look at something like a sit and stand desk, certainly. Helen, you're saying taxis funded through access to work. I've talked about taxis enough today, haven't I? You won't remember anything else though. But no, you're absolutely right. So we'll help with travel, taxi travel, certainly. Rising desk, potentially flexible working, absolutely. If that's something his employee is able to accommodate, maybe. Ergonomic chair. hmm hmm More breaks potentially. So yeah, in terms of access to work, I would say we'd be looking at maybe the taxi travel. Certainly would be my suggestion for Malcolm. Reasonable adjustments could be things like a more specialized chair or one that's more suitable for him, or ergonomic chair. Thank you, Alex. I couldn't think of the word there. Potentially breaks in terms of his workday as well, or the sit and stand desk that we mentioned. Certainly. Then we have Helen. So Helen is a wheelchair user, but has recently been diagnosed with arthritis in her hands and wrists, lives in a rural area and has difficulty using public transport, has recently acquired her own transport, but it's not yet adapted. She's a receptionist in a local charity, struggling with certain more manual tasks as part of her role, as well as needing equipment to make it easier for her to type and support getting into the office. So what might be available there? Audio to type software you're saying there, Claire? I like it. I like it. So you could look at something like Drag and Dictate or I think it's Naturally Speaking, I think it's called. But certainly, yeah. And then she wouldn't have to type as much. Anything else? Access to work, potentially getting the car adapted. Yeah, potentially they could. Like we mentioned earlier, Helen may well be expected to make a contribution towards the cost of that because once it's adapted, it will be available for a personal use. She'll be getting a wider benefit from it. Certainly. Travel again. hmm You could even potentially look at things like could she get a support worker in some of the time to help with the more manual aspects of the job to fulfill those parts of the job role in that case. But certainly that's what I want to be looking at there. Right. So when it comes to supporting people with an access to work application, where can we go? First and foremost, it is worth saying that access to work, it does have a dedicated helpline that is available. And it's available through various different mediums if you need like BSL or video relay and so on. They can help people through the application process first and foremost. Access to Work does also have, we talked about it a bit earlier, its own dedicated mental health support service run by Reemploy on behalf of the DWP. That is available if people are struggling with a mental health condition whilst in work. Outside of the DWP itself, there are various different places that we can go. And like I mentioned earlier, what I'll be doing is I will email you some links and some resources that are relevant to this and everything we've been talking about today. So please don't feel like you need to write everything down. But for instance, disability rights and scope and MenCap and various other places, they do have specific resources available to help people with an access to work application in terms of what they might need to think about, what they might want to include, and so on. So there is support available. So we are coming towards the end, but I do just want to take a minute to mention we are very proud to say that we have Society Matters recently developed a half-day CPD accredited course on access to work. It is not live just yet, but we're looking to roll it out next month. So when I say a half-day course, just to be clear, talking about 4 hours. So it's a bit more in depth than what we've talked about today. So for instance, the course would cover things like the application process, the eligibility, how do you actually manage an access access to work claim day to day once you've got it, evidence that you can use to support a claim, how to prepare for a review of your access to work claim, because you don't get access to work indefinitely. It's typically on a sort of 3-year term, if you like. We will look at how businesses can support their employees, and as also as part of what's something called the cost share agreement, because it may be that there's a cost to the employer depending on the situation. So we'll explore that cost share agreement in some detail. All of that will be explored using some real life case studies from my own experience and citizens advice more widely. The course isn't live just yet. We're looking to roll it out next month. What I'm going to do is shortly, I'm going to pop a link in the chat to a lovely little feedback form. And on there, there's a question about, do you want to sign up to our mailing list? Excuse me. And if you sign up to our mailing list, you will get an email as soon as that course goes live, and you'll be able to book it there. So if this has piqued your interest, then that course will be available very soon. Separately to that, we are also offering a range of free webinars as part of what's called the Ready to Recruit program. Now, first and foremost, there are a few different webinars that are available. We actually have 5. We have reasonable adjustments, where we talk about a little bit like what we've talked about today. Reasonable adjustments, what are they? What constitutes a reasonable adjustment? How can employees support employers rather support employees that need reasonable adjustments? How can we minimize the risk of things like discrimination claims? Access to work, a bit more detail than what we've talked about today, but broadly similar. Getting ready for the Employment Rights Bill. So that is a landmark piece of legislation that the Labour government are talking about at the moment, will be coming into law in the next few months, and it does promise some quite sort of big changes to employment rights. So it's about helping employers understand what those changes are going to be and how to navigate them. We have a session on in-work benefits. So if you have employees that are claiming benefits like universal credit, for instance, how can you as the employer help avoid some pitfalls that might accidentally, I'm sure, sort of impact an employee's benefit claim? And lastly, challenging conversations. So how to sensitively approach difficult conversations with empathy, with respect, in a way that still makes your employees feel valued. Now, these Ready to Recruit webinars, I do just want to be clear, these are available free if you are a business that is located in the Northeast. They are funded through the Northeast Combined Authority. So if you are in the Northeast area, these are available free. You can find details of that on our website, societymatterscic.com. This access to work course, this is for anyone. This is what's going live next month, hopefully, and you'll be able to book through our website for that as well. But these Ready to Recruit webinars, they are specifically for businesses that are in the Northeast. Okay, so I am going to stop the recording now. So does anybody have any questions about anything that we've talked about today? If you want to just take yourselves off mute.